History often depicts Nazi Germany through its military campaigns, Hitler's speeches, and the machinery of the Holocaust. But what these accounts rarely explain is how an entire nation was brainwashed into accepting the final solution, because by the time gas chambers operated and deportation trains rolled toward the east, millions of ordinary Germans had already been reshaped psychologically. They had been conditioned, step by step, year by year, to accept, ignore, or even participate in the systematic destruction of their neighbors. This transformation did not happen through violence alone. It grew from cultural prejudices centuries old. It was amplified by national humiliation after World War I, sharpened by economic collapse, and weaponized by propaganda that turned fear, pride, and desperation into hatred. Hitler did not create this worldview. He inherited it, refined it, and then used it to reprogram an entire society's moral compass. Therefore, before examining how genocide unfolded, we must understand how a modern nation was prepared to believe that such actions were necessary. What follows reveals the ideological roots, political manipulation, and psychological conditioning that allowed the final solution to occur. Section 1. The ideological groundwork. The anti-Semitism that fueled Nazi Germany did not begin with Adolf Hitler. It emerged from prejudices that had existed for centuries across Christian Europe. These beliefs created a foundation that made Nazi ideology easier to accept when it finally arrived. For over 1,000 years, Jewish communities in Europe faced suspicion and hostility. Medieval Christian theology often portrayed Jews as responsible for the death of Christ. This religious antagonism translated into social exclusion. Jews were barred from owning land in many regions. They were forced into certain professions, particularly money lending, which was forbidden to Christians. This created a cycle where Jews became associated with finance, which in turn fueled resentment when debts came due. During times of crisis, these prejudices intensified. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells. Thousands were murdered in violent pogroms. The pattern repeated across centuries. Crisis emerged, society searched for someone to blame, and Jews became convenient scapegoats. However, the nature of anti-Semitism began to change in the 19th century. What had been primarily religious prejudice transformed into something claiming to be scientific. European intellectuals began developing racial theories that categorized humanity into hierarchies. French writer Arthur de Gobineau published influential works arguing that racial mixing led to civilization's decline, portraying certain groups as superior creators of culture. Building on this foundation, British writer Houston Stewart Chamberlain expanded these ideas, specifically targeting Jews as racial threats to European civilization. The concept of racial science made ancient prejudices seem respectable and scientific. Anti-Semitism was no longer just religious superstition. It now claimed to be objective fact. Yet something else made these ideas particularly dangerous. Conspiracy theories began circulating that portrayed Jews as secretly controlling world events. The forgery known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion appeared in Russia around 1903. This fabricated document claimed to reveal a coordinated plot for global domination. Although exposed as fraudulent multiple times, the document still spread throughout Europe and beyond. Millions believed it anyway, but conspiracy theories offered something older prejudices could not. These narratives served a powerful psychological function. They provided simple explanations for complex problems. Economic downturns, political instability, and social change could all be blamed on a single hidden enemy. This worldview transformed Jews from a religious minority into an existential threat. German nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became obsessed with ideas of blood and soil. Thinkers argued that Jews could never truly become German, regardless of how long their families had lived there or how thoroughly they had assimilated. This made coexistence impossible in their framework. By the early 20th century, these ideas had saturated German culture. They appeared in university lectures, political pamphlets, beer hall conversations, and newspaper columns. Anti-Semitism was not fringe, it was mainstream. Most Germans did not actively hate Jews, but most had absorbed the basic assumption that Jews were somehow separate, somehow other, somehow problematic. This foundation made everything that followed possible. Centuries-old prejudices had combined with pseudoscientific racial theories and conspiracy narratives to create a complete worldview. Hitler would not need to invent new ideas. He would only need to activate what was already embedded in German thinking. That activation required only the right conditions. Germany was about to provide them. Section 2. Crisis and Scapegoats. November 11, 1918 marked the end of World War I. For Germany, it marked the beginning of national catastrophe. The country that had entered the war confident of victory now faced total defeat. What followed was not just military collapse, but the disintegration of the world Germans had known. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed terms designed to ensure Germany could never threaten Europe again. The nation lost 13% of its territory, along with all overseas colonies. The military, once among Europe's most powerful, was reduced to a token force of 100,000 men. However, the most painful provision came from Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This single article assigned sole responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies, demanding reparation payments so enormous that the country could never realistically fulfill them. The treaty did not simply end the war, it aimed to reshape Germany's future permanently. The economic consequences were devastating. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed the German currency completely. Prices rose at incomprehensible rates. For example, a loaf of bread that cost a reasonable amount in January 1923 cost thousands of times more by November. As a result, life savings disappeared overnight. The middle class watched generations of accumulated wealth become worthless. Workers received wages in wheelbarrows simply because they needed so much paper money for basic purchases. This economic collapse changed how Germans thought and felt about everything. They had been taught to value thrift, hard work, and financial responsibility. Now these values meant nothing. Those who had followed the rules lost everything. Meanwhile, some individuals profited from the chaos, particularly those with access to foreign currency or hard assets. When some of these profiteers were Jewish, existing prejudices grew stronger. Political conflict consumed German streets during this period. Communist revolutionaries clashed with right-wing paramilitary groups, while the Weimar Republic struggled to maintain order between 1918 and 1923. Germany experienced multiple attempted coups and regional uprisings. The government itself seemed incapable of providing stability, leading many Germans to question whether democracy could work in Germany at all. Into this chaos came a narrative that seemed to explain everything: the stab-in-the-back myth. Right-wing nationalists argued that Germany had not lost the war militarily. Instead, the army had been betrayed from within. Communists, socialists, and Jews had supposedly undermined the war effort, forcing surrender when victory was still possible. This myth gained traction despite having no factual basis. The myth was emotionally powerful. It allowed Germans to maintain pride in their military while explaining the confusing defeat. More importantly, it identified specific enemies. Those who had supposedly stabbed Germany in the back. Jews appeared frequently in these accusations, particularly after some Jewish intellectuals and politicians had participated in the revolutionary governments of 1918 and 1919. Fear of communism strengthened these feelings. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had frightened conservative Germans deeply. When communist uprisings broke out in Germany itself, panic spread through the middle and upper classes. Nazi propaganda would later use this fear by consistently linking Jews with Bolshevism. Despite the fact that most Jews were not communists and most communists were not Jews, the association took hold in German thinking. These fears and resentments simmered throughout the 1920s. Then, in 1929, the Great Depression struck and made everything worse. Unemployment reached staggering levels. By 1932, over 6 million Germans were unemployed. Young men who should have been starting careers found nothing available. Families faced poverty and hunger. The Weimar government seemed powerless to respond effectively, and each failed policy increased frustration and desperation. In this environment, conspiracy theories flourished. The idea that hidden forces controlled Germany's fate provided comfort to many. It suggested that Germany's problems had external causes rather than internal failures. It promised that identifying and removing these harmful forces could restore national greatness. These narratives offered something the complex truth could not: simplicity. There were no difficult economic analyses to understand, no complicated political compromises to consider. There was only a clear enemy and a promised solution. Democratic government requires patience, compromise, and trust. Post-war Germany had none of these. Political failures weakened faith in democracy, while economic crises made authoritarian alternatives increasingly appealing. Many Germans began believing that what the nation needed was not debate but decisiveness, not parliament, but a strong leader who could act without constraint. This created the opening Hitler would exploit. Germans were not looking for genocide during this period. They were looking for stability, prosperity, and restored national pride. They were looking for someone to blame for their suffering and someone to promise that better days would come. The Nazi Party would offer both, but the party's success depended entirely on one man's ability to weaponize Germany's desperation. Section 3. Hitler's Rise and Brainwashing. Adolf Hitler did not invent German anti-Semitism. What made him dangerous was his ability to transform widespread prejudices into focused political ideology. He took centuries of cultural bias and turned it into a weapon that would reshape Germany completely. The Nazi leader's own anti-Semitism had developed during his years in Vienna before World War I. In his autobiography, he described this period as his political awakening. Vienna was home to a large Jewish population, and the city's politics featured prominent anti-Semitic parties. The future dictator absorbed these ideas completely. By the time he returned to Munich after the war, his worldview had hardened into something fixed and unchangeable. Jews were not merely a problem to be managed. They were the central problem from which all other threats came. The content of his early speeches in Munich followed the same formula. The Nazi leader portrayed Germany as the victim of a great injustice. He described German suffering in specific detail, from the starvation during the British blockade, to the shame of Versailles, to the economic collapse. He made audiences feel that their pain was understood. Then he provided the explanation they desperately wanted. Germany suffered because enemies were working against it from within, specifically Jewish enemies. The Nazi Party remained small through the 1920s. The Beer Hall Putsch of 1923, Hitler's failed attempt to seize power in Munich, resulted in his imprisonment. However, he used this time productively, writing the first volume of Mein Kampf. This book laid out his ideology with disturbing clarity. Jews were described as parasites destroying German racial purity, while democracy was dismissed as weakness. According to this vision, Germany's future required territorial expansion, racial purification, and the elimination of Jewish influence. Most observers dismissed the Nazi leader as a fanatical extremist. His ideas seemed too radical to gain mainstream support. This assessment turned out to be completely wrong. The Great Depression that began in 1929 changed everything. As unemployment soared and the Weimar government floundered, the Nazi Party's message found new audiences. Germans who would never have considered voting for the Führer in 1928 did so in 1930, then again in larger numbers in 1932. What happened was not that Germans suddenly became convinced Nazis. Most who voted for Hitler did not fully embrace his ideology. They voted for him because they wanted change, stability, and someone who seemed strong enough to fix Germany's problems. They convinced themselves they could control him once he was in power. This would become one of the most disastrous miscalculations in history. In the November 1932 elections, the Nazi Party received 33% of the vote, substantial but not dominant. This gave conservative politicians an idea. They believed they could use the party leader's popularity while holding back his extreme ideas. The Nazi leader had different plans entirely. Historian Ian Kershaw documents that the dictator's appointment as chancellor came in January 1933. Once in power, the new chancellor moved quickly to take complete control. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the excuse he needed. Using emergency powers, civil liberties were suspended and political opponents were arrested. Then, in March 1933, the Enabling Act gave the government the power to create laws without parliamentary approval. Within months, Germany had transformed from democracy to dictatorship. However, brainwashing does not occur through political actions alone. The Nazi regime understood this. They needed to reach into people's daily lives, shaping how Germans thought, felt, and understood reality. This required propaganda on a scale never before attempted. Joseph Goebbels became Minister of Propaganda in March 1933. His task was to fill German consciousness with Nazi ideology. Every form of media came under control. Newspapers that did not conform were shut down, while radio broadcasts were coordinated from central offices. Film production fell under strict monitoring, and publishing houses removed unwanted authors from their lists. Germans were to hear one message from all directions, repeated constantly until alternatives became unthinkable. The propaganda worked on multiple levels at the same time. It promoted the Führer as Germany's savior. His image appeared everywhere: posters, stamps, photographs, films, newsreels. He was portrayed as Germany's father figure, a man of destiny, the only leader who truly understood the nation's needs. This constant visual presence created false familiarity. Germans felt they knew their leader personally, even when they had never met him. At the same time, propaganda portrayed Jews as less than human. Cartoons depicted them with exaggerated features, while films showed them as criminals and parasites. In schools, teachers instructed children in racial science, and textbooks included math problems calculating the cost of caring for disabled Germans. The message was clear: some lives had no value. This process happened gradually. Each step moved slightly beyond what had come before. Each step prepared Germans for what would come next. During this same period, early successes strengthened the leader's authority. Unemployment dropped dramatically as government spending increased, infrastructure projects provided jobs, and Germans who had faced desperate times saw real improvement in their lives. They credited this recovery entirely to the Führer, overlooking that economies across the world were recovering during this same period. To them, order was replacing chaos, pride was replacing shame, and the nation was rising again. The cost of these improvements remained hidden. On the other hand, those who opposed the regime faced immediate consequences. Stormtroopers, the SA paramilitary force, intimidated those who disagreed. Concentration camps opened in 1933, initially to hold political prisoners. Communists, socialists, trade unionists, and others who might organize resistance were arrested. Jews who had been politically active were targeted. The message was clear: opposition was dangerous. But there was another message, equally important. Good Germans had nothing to fear. If you were not a communist, not a Jew, not a troublemaker, if you simply accepted the new order, your life could improve. This created a powerful reason to go along. Why risk everything by resisting when compliance brought benefits? This was the early stage of brainwashing. By the end of 1933, the regime had taken control of information, created emotional bonds with the population, achieved visible successes, and established costs for resistance. Germans who might have objected found themselves increasingly isolated. The social pressure to go along grew stronger each month. Soon, questioning the Führer seemed not just dangerous, but somehow disloyal, ungrateful, even unpatriotic. Yet the full horror of where this led remained hidden. In 1933, few Germans imagined their government would eventually organize industrial genocide. The path to that outcome would begin with something far more ordinary: paperwork. Section 4. Turning prejudice into law. The Nazi regime did not immediately begin the final solution. Instead, it slowly turned prejudice into actual laws, creating a system that made discrimination seem normal. This process happened in stages, with each step building on the last and preparing Germans to accept things that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The first public test came on April 1st, 1933. The Nazi Party organized the first nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Stormtroopers stood outside Jewish-owned shops, deterring customers' signs, proclaimed warnings against buying from Jews. The boycott was presented as spontaneous grassroots action, though it was entirely organized from above. Its purpose was testing public reaction to see whether Germans would comply or resist. Most complied without question, some actively participated, and few openly resisted. This boycott revealed the power of social pressure. Even Germans who felt uncomfortable with the action often went along because everyone else did. Those who continued patronizing Jewish businesses risked being identified, questioned, shamed. The path of least resistance was conformity. Each act of conformity made the next one easier. However, the regime had only just begun. Just days later, the government moved to formalize discrimination through law. In April 1933, only weeks after the Führer became chancellor, the government enacted the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. This law removed Jews from government positions. Jewish judges, teachers, and civil servants lost their jobs. The stated justification was protecting German interests. The actual purpose was exclusion. Throughout 1933 and into 1934, similar measures spread rapidly across other sectors. Universities dismissed Jewish professors, while hospitals removed Jewish doctors from staff positions. Law firms barred Jewish attorneys from practice, and cultural institutions expelled Jewish musicians, actors, and artists. In each case, the rationale presented was that Jews had unfair influence that needed correcting. The real goal was making it impossible for them to earn a living. Yet, something unexpected happened. These actions met surprisingly little resistance because many non-Jewish professionals benefited directly. When Jewish colleagues disappeared, vacancies opened up. Promotions that normally took years came quickly. Competitors vanished overnight. The regime framed all of this as justice, claiming that qualified Germans were finally getting what they deserved. Questions about fairness never gained traction because too many people stood to gain. During this same period, public spaces became hostile territory for Jewish Germans. Municipalities began posting signs excluding Jews from parks, swimming pools, and public facilities. Restaurants and shops displayed notices warning Jews away. These were not official government mandates initially. Local authorities and private business owners made these choices independently. This reveals something crucial. The regime did not need to order every discriminatory action. Citizens anticipated what was desired and acted accordingly. Meanwhile, the next generation was being reshaped entirely. By the mid-1930s, schools had become indoctrination centers for Nazi racial ideology. Children learned that humanity divided into distinct racial categories with different values. Textbooks included detailed descriptions of supposed Jewish racial characteristics. Biology classes taught that racial mixing weakened civilization. Mathematics problems calculated costs of institutionalizing disabled individuals, suggesting that some lives had no value. Teachers who refused to teach this curriculum lost their positions. Those who remained shaped the next generation's worldview. The Hitler Youth Organization provided additional programming for young people during these years. Children attended camps where physical training mixed with ideological instruction. They learned songs praising the Führer and Germany, along with lessons about how Jews threatened the nation. Most importantly, they were taught that loyalty to their leader came before everything else, even loyalty to parents. Former Hitler Youth members later recalled that these experiences felt exciting, purposeful, and empowering rather than manipulative. To them, it was not brainwashing, but belonging. Nevertheless, the regime sought to make discrimination permanent. In September 1935, the Nuremberg laws formalized racial categories into legal structure. These laws defined who qualified as Jewish Jewish based on ancestry, not religious practice. Even Germans who had converted to Christianity were classified as Jewish if they had Jewish grandparents. The laws prohibited marriage and intimate relationships between Jews and citizens of German blood. They removed Jews of citizenship, reducing them to subjects without legal rights. The Nuremberg laws did not create new prejudices. They simply turned existing attitudes into official rules. This served several purposes. It satisfied Nazi leaders who wanted clear racial boundaries and provided legal protection for discrimination. Most importantly, it continued making discrimination seem normal. What had been social prejudice was now law. What had been informal became official. The government's authority made hatred legal. As conditions worsened, German Jews faced impossible choices. Those who considered leaving would have to abandon their homes and possessions. Those who stayed could only hope the situation would improve either way. Emigration required money, countries willing to accept them, and the strength to start completely over. Many nations imposed strict quotas on Jewish immigration, and countries like the United States and Britain could have accepted far more refugees, but chose not to. German Jews found themselves trapped as their situation grew increasingly desperate. Those who remained tried to maintain dignity despite constant humiliation. They continued practicing their professions where possible and maintained religious observance. They assured their children that this situation was temporary, believing, because they needed to believe, that civilized Germany would not descend into barbarism. They remembered that Jews had lived in German lands for over 1,000 years and saw themselves as Germans. Their patriotism remained strong even as their country rejected them. Still, the world had a chance to intervene, but it refused. By 1938, the international community had demonstrated its unwillingness to help. In July of that year, representatives from 32 countries met at the Evian Conference to discuss the refugee crisis. Most concluded that accepting more Jews was impossible. Australia's representative summarized the prevailing attitude when he stated the country had no racial problem and was not desirous of importing one. The message to German Jews was clear: there would be no rescue. Then came the night that changed everything. On November 9th and 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, erupted across Germany. Following the assassination of a German diplomat by a Jewish teenager in Paris, the Nazi regime orchestrated nationwide attacks against Jewish communities. Stormtroopers, SS members, and civilians destroyed thousands of Jewish businesses and homes. Synagogues burned across Germany. At least 91 Jews perished during the events. Authorities arrested approximately 30,000 Jewish men and sent them to concentration camps. The attacks were presented as spontaneous outrage. They were nothing of the sort. The regime planned and coordinated the actions centrally. Local Nazi officials received instructions. Police were ordered not to interfere unless German property was threatened. Fire departments stood by as synagogues burned, intervening only when flames risked spreading to neighboring buildings. What mattered most was how Germans responded. While some were horrified and many felt uncomfortable, few openly protested. The regime then forced those targeted to pay for the damage themselves. Jewish communities faced massive fines, and the state confiscated their insurance claims. The message could not have been clearer. Jews were not merely unwanted, but actively targeted. After Kristallnacht, Jewish emigration transformed into desperate flight. Those who had money abandoned everything they owned to escape, and those without money tried anyway. Meanwhile, countries that had already been reluctant to accept Jewish refugees became even more restrictive, making escape nearly impossible. By 1939, the trap had closed completely. German Jews faced comprehensive exclusion. Business ownership, public schools, and most public spaces were all forbidden to them. They were required to carry identification papers and obey curfews while being forced into segregated housing. The regime had stripped away their citizenship, confiscated their property, and denied their humanity. Yet even this was not the final solution. That transformation required one more element, and it was coming. Within months, war would provide the cover the regime needed to complete what years of legal discrimination had begun. Section 5. War and Mass Atrocities. World War II began on September 1, 1939, when German forces invaded Poland. This was not merely military expansion, but the beginning of an ideological war that would ultimately consume millions. For the Führer, the invasion of Poland marked the moment when Nazi anti-Semitism crossed the threshold from persecution to systematic extermination. Poland was home to Europe's largest Jewish population, over 3 million people. Within weeks of conquest, German occupation forces began implementing policies that foreshadowed what was to come. Jews were forced into designated districts of cities and separated from the general population. These ghettos were sealed with walls, barbed wire, and armed guards. The stated purpose was disease prevention, but the actual purpose was concentration and control. The creation of these ghettos represented more than physical segregation. They served as holding areas where Nazi authorities could monitor, exploit, and ultimately eliminate the Jewish population. The regime established administrative structures specifically designed to manage this process. By 1940, civil service, police, and registry offices had already established bureaucratic systems for identifying, tracking, and processing Jews. These systems seamlessly transitioned to deportation and extermination logistics. Conditions inside were designed to take lives slowly. According to historian Lawrence Rees, Warsaw's ghetto, established in October 1940, confined 400,000 people into approximately 1.3 square miles. That meant roughly 7 people per room, with families crammed into spaces meant for single occupants. Food rations were set at starvation levels by explicit policy. Official allotments provided only 184 calories per day for Jews, compared to 2,310 calories for Germans. This was not oversight or neglect, but calculated extermination through deprivation. Typhus and other diseases spread rapidly under these conditions. Inadequate sanitation, overcrowding, and weakened immune systems from starvation created perfect environments for epidemics. Bodies appeared on streets each morning, those who had perished from hunger and illness. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition became common sights. The elderly perished first, then the very young, then anyone too weak to compete for scarce resources. The German administration recorded these losses meticulously but did nothing to prevent them, compiling statistics and tracking rates with bureaucratic precision while ensuring conditions remained lethal. This was intentional policy. Governor General Hans Frank, who administered occupied Poland, stated explicitly that Jews should be left to perish. In meetings with officials, he described the plan clearly: seal them in, starve them, and wait. Documents from this period show German authorities calculating rates and discussing how long it would take for natural causes to eliminate the Jewish population. They treated mass destruction as an administrative problem requiring patient management. However, this approach had one critical problem. It was passive, depending on disease and hunger to do the work. Most importantly, it was too slow. As Germany conquered more territory throughout 1940 and 1941, more Jews fell under Nazi control. The populations in ghettos swelled with deportees from Germany and other occupied territories. The Jewish problem, in Nazi terminology, was growing rather than shrinking despite the losses. Nazi leadership began considering alternatives. During the summer of 1940, following France's defeat, one plan involved deporting all European Jews to Madagascar, a French colony off Africa's east coast. The regime briefly considered this scheme, but it proved impractical. The Madagascar plan was abandoned by early 1941. Nevertheless, it revealed crucial thinking. Nazi leadership sought to remove Jews entirely from Europe. As territorial gains continued into 1941, the need for a more comprehensive solution became urgent. Then came the invasion that changed everything. On June 22, 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union. The dictator described this campaign as a war of annihilation against Jewish Bolshevism. Throughout the campaign and beyond, the Nazi leader portrayed the Soviet Union as a Jewish Bolshevik regime, combining racial and ideological enemies into a single threat that had to be completely destroyed. This was not regular warfare following international rules. It was extermination that the regime justified as military necessity. Special units called Einsatzgruppen followed behind the advancing German army. 4 main groups, designated A, B, C, and D, were assigned to different sectors of the front. Each group subdivided into smaller units called Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos. Their task, officially described in euphemistic terms, was eliminating political commissars, communist officials, and Jews. The language used in orders and reports was intentionally vague. Special treatment, cleansing operations, executive measures. The reality beneath these phrases was mass extermination carried out systematically, unit by unit, town by town, across the newly occupied territories. Initially, during June and July 1941, the Einsatzgruppen focused primarily on military-age Jewish men. The justification presented was security. These men were labeled as potential partisans, communist sympathizers, or threats to German forces. They were rounded up, taken to sites outside villages, and shot. Thousands perished in these early operations. But this limitation did not last long. By August 1941, the operations had escalated to include entire communities. The restriction to military-age males disappeared. Women, children, elderly, everyone Jewish was now targeted. Orders from Berlin, transmitted through Himmler and Heydrich, made this expansion clear. On September 1941, the Einsatzgruppen were conducting operations that eliminated everyone in Jewish communities they encountered. The transformation from selective actions to total extermination occurred in mere weeks. The methods were direct and lacked the psychological distance that gas chambers would later provide. Those targeted were marched to ravines, forests, or specially dug pits outside their towns. They were ordered to disrobe, supposedly for delousing or work assignment, but actually to make disposal of bodies and collection of valuables easier. They were lined up at pit edges and shot. Sometimes they were forced to lie down on top of previous casualties before being shot themselves. This continued in waves throughout each day of operations, with guards rotating regularly because the psychological strain, even on committed Nazis, was intense. At Babi Yar, a ravine near Kiev, over 33,771 Jews perished in just 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941. Similar atrocities occurred across occupied Soviet territory throughout fall 1941. At Rumbala Forest near Riga, approximately 25,000 Jews were shot in late November and early December. At the 9th Fort near Kaunas, Lithuania, thousands more perished. The Einsatzgruppen reports, sent back to Berlin regularly, documented these operations with careful record-keeping. They tracked numbers like production quotas, reporting totals to headquarters as though eliminating civilians was a measurable goal. Yet even this method had problems for the regime. The psychological impact on those carrying out the shootings became a concern for Nazi leadership. Shooting thousands of unarmed people, including children, produced severe stress even in ideologically committed personnel. Some refused and requested transfers. Others drank heavily to cope. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler witnessed one execution in Minsk and reportedly looked away as people were shot. This was not compassion, but recognition that mass shooting was inefficient and psychologically damaging to German personnel. This practical problem drove the search for alternative methods. Gas vans, trucks with exhaust pipes, rerouted into sealed cargo compartments, were deployed in late 1941. Those targeted were locked inside and suffocated by carbon monoxide as the vehicle drove. Chelmno began operations using gas vans in December 1941. This method reduced direct confrontation between those carrying out the actions and those they targeted, allowing them to maintain psychological distance from what they were doing. Historians recognize this as a crucial step toward industrialized extermination. Throughout 1941, the German leader justified what was happening through repeated reference to prophecy. Historian Ian Kershaw notes that years earlier, on January 30th, 1939, in a speech to the Reichstag, he had declared that if international Jewry plunged the world into war, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. He invoked this statement constantly as events unfolded. On January 30th, 1941, he repeated this prophecy to the Reichstag, stating warning that if the rest of the world was plunged into general war through Jewry, then the whole of Jewry would have played out its role in Europe. Later that year, on October 25, 1941, during his table talk, the Führer stated that from the rostrum of the Reichstag he had prophesied to Jewry that the Jew would disappear from Europe if war were not avoided. He claimed that race of criminals already had on its conscience the 2 million lost in the First World War, and now it had hundreds of thousands more. He said Jews were getting their deserved punishment. Then, on December 12, 1941, the Nazi leader gave a speech to Gauleiter, his regional party bosses, that explicitly connected World War with extermination of the Jews. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels recorded the significance in his diary entry from December 13, 1941. Goebbels wrote that, with respect to the Jewish question, the Führer had decided to make a clean sweep. He had prophesied to the Jews that if they were to bring about another world war, they would experience their own annihilation. This was not just a phrase, the world war was here, and the annihilation of Jewry must be the necessary consequence. These statements served multiple functions. They provided ideological justification for escalating actions, implied that extermination was defensive retaliation rather than unprovoked aggression, and created collective responsibility among Nazi leadership by making them aware of what was occurring. However, the dictator characteristically avoided written orders, preferring verbal authorization given to Himmler and Heydrich. This maintained his ability to deny direct knowledge while ensuring his will was executed. Historian Ian Kershaw describes this pattern as working towards the Führer. Subordinates did not need direct orders. They anticipated what the leader wanted and made policies more extreme accordingly. Officials at all levels took initiatives to fulfill his presumed desires, creating competitive efforts to prove loyalty without the dictator needing to give specific commands. During this same period in autumn 1941, systematic deportations from the Reich began under the coded language of resettlement or evacuation to the east. In October 1941, deportations from Germany started. By November, the first deportees were being shot on arrival in the east. Goebbels noted in his diary entry from November 18, 1941, regarding Jews being evacuated from Berlin, that Jewry gradually realized what was being prepared for them. Thus, their hatred was expressed in small acts of resistance against Nazi measures. But, he wrote, the regime was up to it. Meanwhile, the regime moved to coordinate the entire government system. On January 20th, 1942, 15 high-ranking officials gathered at a villa in Wannsee, a Berlin suburb, for a meeting that would coordinate the final solution. Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, chaired the conference. The attendees represented every major government ministry: Interior, Justice, Foreign Office, the Four-Year Plan Economic Office, and others. The purpose was ensuring complete cooperation across all agencies in what was termed in coded language the final solution to the European Jewish question. The Wannsee Protocol, the meeting's minutes, demonstrates how extermination became administrative routine. The document discusses transporting 11 million Jews from across Europe to the east, describes natural reduction through forced labor, addresses how to classify partial Jews, and resolves disagreements about authority between agencies. The language is matter-of-fact, clinical, detached. There is no explicit mention of gas chambers or mass shooting, yet every participant understood what final solution meant. No one objected, no one resigned. Each agreed to contribute their agency's resources to implementing the plan. This meeting was not where extermination was decided. Mass operations were already underway in occupied Soviet territory. Wannsee's significance was coordination. It ensured that railway officials would schedule deportation trains, finance ministry officials would seize Jewish property, and Foreign Office diplomats would pressure Allied governments to surrender their Jewish populations. Each ministry's cooperation made extermination possible on a continental scale. By spring 1942, the system was fully operational. Purpose-built extermination camps opened in occupied Poland. Belzec began operations in March 1942, Sobibor in April 1942, and Treblinka in July July 1942. These were not concentration camps where prisoners might survive through labor. These were pure destruction centers. Most arrivals perished within hours. The camp's sole function was efficient extermination. Auschwitz-Birkenau represented the peak of this system. Originally established as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, Auschwitz expanded dramatically with the construction of Birkenau in 1941 and 1942. Gas chambers using Zyklon B poison gas became operational by spring 1942. The complex eventually included multiple large gas chambers with adjacent crematoria capable of processing and disposing of thousands daily. The scale was industrial. However, the regime had developed expertise in this kind of operation years earlier. The euthanasia program, known as T4, had provided a crucial foundation. This program had targeted disabled Germans, those deemed unworthy of life under Nazi racial ideology. Beginning in 1939, disabled children and adults were eliminated in special facilities. The methods used were experimental at first: lethal injections, then gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. The regime refined techniques for efficient operations, tested deception strategies, and trained personnel. In August 1941, the dictator ordered a halt to the official T4 program after protests from German families and some church leaders. However, unofficial operations continued in hospitals and institutions across Germany. More importantly, the program's structure did not disappear. It was repurposed. Personnel who had operated T4 centers, men with experience and techniques for managing such operations, were transferred directly to extermination camps in Poland. The methods they had perfected, particularly the use of gas chambers, moved with them. The administrative systems for processing those targeted, maintaining records, and disposing of bodies were adapted for the final solution. This transfer reveals something significant about how the Holocaust developed. The regime did not invent it from nothing, but built on existing programs, existing expertise, and existing government structures. Each phase provided foundations for the next. The T4 program had demonstrated that Germans could be organized to systematically eliminate other Germans, that such operations could be industrialized, that coded language could hide reality, and that government systems could transform atrocity into routine administration. These lessons were applied on vastly larger scale to Jews, Roma, and others targeted for extermination. The camp operations followed a clear process. Trains arrived on ramps directly connected to the facilities, where SS doctors immediately performed selections on the platform. Those deemed unfit for labor, including children, elderly, and sick, were sent straight to gas chambers. Those selected for work received registration numbers tattooed on their arms and might survive days, weeks, or months before succumbing to starvation, disease, or being selected for gassing when they became too weak for labor. The regime maintained careful deception about these camps' true nature. Deportees were told they were being resettled for work in the East and were instructed to bring luggage and valuables. At some camps, those targeted entered buildings marked as showers. They undressed, surrendered valuables, and proceeded into chambers they believed were for delousing. Only when the doors sealed and gas began did they understand. By then, resistance was impossible. This deception served multiple purposes. It reduced panic during deportations, making logistics easier. It prevented resistance. It allowed those carrying out the operations to maintain the fiction that they were merely implementing resettlement policy. Everyone involved understood the truth, yet the coded language provided psychological cover. By summer 1942, the process had industrialized. Deportation trains arrived daily, immediate selections occurred, gas chambers operated continuously, and crematoria disposed of bodies. Approximately 1.7 million people perished in Operation Reinhard camps, which included Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, by November 1943 alone. Even as the military situation worsened through 1943, the Nazi leader insisted extermination continue. The regime diverted critical rail transport from military operations to continue deportations. This was not rational military strategy, but ideological obsession taking priority over Germany's survival. The pace intensified again in 1944. After Germany occupied Hungary on March 19, 1944, Adolf Eichmann personally supervised deportation deportation of Hungarian Jews. Historian Ian Kershaw records that between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, a total of 437,402 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. Hungarian Regent Miklos Horthy halted deportations on July 7th, a decision that saved many lives remaining in Budapest. It also demonstrated that resistance was possible, though other leaders in occupied territories who could have made similar choices chose not to. As the Reich collapsed, the extermination continued. As camps evacuated before Soviet advance in late 1944 and early 1945, tens of thousands were forced on marches westward. Guards shot stragglers. Massive losses resulted from exhaustion, exposure, and brutality. Hungarian Jews were marched to Austria as forced labor when trains became unavailable. Operations continued into 1945, even as the Reich collapsed. Auschwitz operated until Soviet liberation on January 27, 1945. Camps like Bergen-Belsen became traps where disease and starvation claimed thousands more lives. The transformation from occupation to the final solution required participation across German society and government. Understanding this transformation requires examining the people who made it possible. Section 6. Enabling the Holocaust. The Holocaust was not carried out by a small group of fanatics acting alone. It required the participation, cooperation, or passive acceptance of millions. The explanation involves psychological mechanisms that remain disturbing because they exist in all humans. People naturally look to others for guidance on appropriate behavior, particularly in uncertain or stressful situations. In Nazi Germany, this tendency was systematically exploited when friends, neighbors, and colleagues accepted discriminatory policies without protest. Individuals concluded that acceptance must be correct. Each person's silence reinforced everyone else's silence. The progression happened gradually over years. Germans did not wake up one morning suddenly willing to participate in the final solution. They adapted to changes that came step by step, each only slightly worse than the last. During the 1930s, Germans accepted the exclusion of Jews from civil service, which made accepting exclusion from professions easier. When professions were barred, accepting business boycotts seemed like a small additional step. After boycotts came property seizure, then forced deportation, then extermination. No single step seemed like the huge moral line it represented, each built on acceptance of what came before. Obedience to authority played a crucial role. Nazi Germany provided real-world demonstration of this principle. SS officers, Wehrmacht soldiers, and civilian administrators followed orders to participate in atrocities. Some questioned, but few refused. Those who did refuse tasks were generally not punished severely. They might be mocked, excluded, or transferred, but rarely executed. This reveals something crucial. Participation was more about conformity than force. People followed orders, not because they would face consequences for refusing, but because authority had conditioned them to obey. The regime strengthened obedience through loyalty oaths. All civil servants, teachers, soldiers, and others in official positions swore personal loyalty to the Führer. These oaths had powerful psychological effects. Breaking an oath violated deeply held values of honor and commitment, transforming abstract national policy into personal obligation. Refusing orders was not merely disobedience, but personal betrayal of a sacred promise. Treating targets as less than human was essential to enabling participation. Nazi propaganda consistently portrayed Jews as parasites, vermin, and disease carriers. Films like The Eternal Jew compared Jews to rats, showing rats emerging from sewers alongside footage of Jews in ghettos. This messaging served a specific psychological function. When targets are treated as less than human, empathy shuts down. This allowed those carrying out actions to inflict suffering without experiencing normal psychological discomfort, believing they were eliminating threats rather than harming people. The process was reinforced through language. Official documents never used direct words. Instead, Jews were evacuated, resettled, or given special treatment. Even the phrase "final solution" was coded language. This allowed bureaucrats to discuss the Holocaust without facing what they were actually doing. They told themselves they were not organizing extermination, but simply solving administrative problems. The vague language gave them psychological distance from reality. Breaking responsibility across many people further spread out accountability. No single individual organized the Holocaust alone. Railway workers scheduled trains but did not know precisely where they went. Finance officials processed property seizures but did not witness what happened next. Camp guards operated facilities but did not make the policies. Each could tell themselves they were only following orders, only doing their job, only one small part of a larger operation they did not control. Kershaw's concept of working towards the Führer reveals another dimension. Officials at all levels did not wait for explicit orders. They anticipated what the leader wanted and took initiatives to fulfill his presumed desires. This created a situation where administrators tried to outdo each other in demonstrating ideological commitment, each proposing more extreme measures to prove loyalty. This dynamic meant the dictator did not need to give specific commands. He simply set the ideological direction, and subordinates competed to execute it most thoroughly. Once deportations began in autumn 1941, railway officials scheduled trains based on deportation quotas, treating human cargo like any other freight. They coordinated timetables, allocated train cars, and calculated costs. Finance ministry officials confiscated property systematically, cataloging valuables, processing sales of seized assets, and transferring funds to Reich accounts. Foreign Office diplomats negotiated with Allied and occupied governments to secure deportations of their Jewish populations, using diplomatic pressure, threats, and rewards to overcome resistance. Each agency treated mass extermination as routine administrative task requiring professional competence. This created what might be called ordinary participation by ordinary people. Mid-level officials were not ideological fanatics consumed by hatred. They were career bureaucrats focused on doing their jobs efficiently. They received assignments, allocated resources, solved logistical problems, and filed reports. The fact that their work enabled the Holocaust was hidden by layers of government procedure and coded language. They were not organizing extermination. They were processing evacuations, managing special measures, and coordinating resettlement operations. By 1942, the Holocaust had become normalized within the government system. Officials processed deportation paperwork, coordinated logistics, and tracked resettlement numbers as ordinary office work. They took lunch breaks, complained about workload, sought promotions, and went home to families. The horrific coexisted with the mundane. Moral categories were suspended in administrative routine. What had been unthinkable became policy. What had been policy became procedure. What had been procedure became habit. Historian Ian Kershaw notes that this normalization reveals how ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil through gradual immersion rather than sudden transformation. No one woke up deciding to facilitate the Holocaust. They made small choices, accepting a job assignment, processing paperwork without questioning its purpose, prioritizing career advancement over moral concerns, and maintaining silence when questions arose. Each small choice made the next one easier until they found themselves essential to a system of mass extermination without ever feeling they had made a defining moral choice. But ideology alone does not explain widespread participation. When Jews were deported, their property became available for seizure. Apartments were reassigned to Germans, businesses were sold at below-market prices to non-Jews, and personal possessions were auctioned off. Thousands of Germans benefited materially from their neighbors' losses, creating personal stake in not questioning what was happening. Acknowledging the crime meant acknowledging their own complicity and potentially giving up the benefits they had gained. Military and SS personnel followed orders to commit atrocities with rare dissent. Those who refused tasks generally were not executed, but simply transferred to other duties. This shows that participation was more about conformity than force. Shutting off conscience operated at psychological and philosophical levels. Propaganda had spent years arguing that Jews threatened German survival, and by 1941 and 1942, many Germans accepted this premise. If Jews truly endangered the nation, then removing them could be presented as self-defense rather than crime. Meanwhile, most ordinary Germans chose not to know the truth. Many Germans knew something terrible was happening. Soldiers on leave spoke vaguely of atrocities in the East. Jewish neighbors disappeared without explanation, and rumors circulated constantly. Yet most did not seek detailed knowledge because knowing would create moral obligation to act. Ignorance provided psychological shelter. If they did not know for certain, they could not be held responsible for failing to intervene. This willful ignorance was particularly evident in reports compiled by the SD, the SS Intelligence Service, which monitored public opinion. These reports from 1941 through 1943 show Germans were aware of harsh measures being taken in occupied territories. These reports, compiled regularly by SS intelligence officers stationed throughout Germany, monitored conversations in pubs, workplaces, shops, and other public spaces. They documented what ordinary Germans said when they thought no one official was listening. The reports reveal a population that knew enough to understand the Holocaust was occurring, but chose not to investigate further or protest. Germans expressed some concern privately, but remained publicly silent. Fear of consequences for dissent, combined with social pressure to conform, created a situation where everyone privately doubted, but believed everyone else accepted, so no one spoke up. Even as the Reich collapsed, loyalty persisted. Kershaw notes that the Gauleiter, regional party bosses, remained extremely loyal. A meeting on February 24, 1945, showed most still believed in their leader despite the disastrous military situation. Their loyalty enforced compliance down through party apparatus. In April 1945, despite obvious defeat, the Führer's inner circle in the bunker maintained rituals of deference, loyalty oaths, and optimistic reports even when they made no military sense. Fear of breaking with group consensus was stronger than rational assessment. Goebbels demonstrated this self-deception clearly. The propaganda minister genuinely believed in his leader and final victory, despite private acknowledgement of the desperate situation. This shows the power of ideological commitment to override rational judgment. Goebbels remained in the bunker through the end, fully embracing the heroic ending narrative. In Kershaw's book Hitler, the historian notes that Goebbels brought his wife and 6 children to perish alongside the Führer in April 1945, seeing it as achieving legendary status for National Socialism. Throughout 1944 and 1945, Goebbels maintained anti-Semitic messaging and actively supported extermination policies through propaganda. His role throughout the war was preparing the public for escalating measures. Throughout the collapse, he consistently promoted imagery of heroism and historical parallels to maintain fighting spirit despite obvious defeat. When Kohlberg fell to Soviets in March 1945, Goebbels suppressed the news because it contradicted his propaganda film about heroic defense. Military obedience to absurd orders continued. Generals kept executing the dictator's military plans despite knowing they were futile. Fear of treason accusations overcame professional judgment. The regime had created conditions where conformity felt safer than resistance, where following orders seemed more honorable than questioning them, and where participating in the Holocaust appeared more acceptable than standing apart. Despite these overwhelming pressures, some chose to resist. Some Germans hid Jews, provided false documents, or warned them of impending deportations. These acts demonstrate that resistance was possible. However, these individuals were rare precisely because they violated every social pressure operating around them. They risked their safety, their family's safety, and their social standing. The fact that so few made this choice reveals how powerful the forces promoting conformity were. The psychological distance between those carrying out actions and their targets was carefully maintained. Most Germans never saw inside extermination camps. They never witnessed the gas chambers or crematoria. They never heard the screams or saw the bodies. This distance allowed them to minimize what was occurring. All they saw was deportation, people boarding trains. What happened after the trains left remained abstract and distant, occurring somewhere far away, affecting people they did not know, carried out by others they would never meet. For those directly involved, psychological adjustments were necessary. Guards at camps described going through distinct phases over time. Initial horror gradually gave way to emotional numbing as actions became routine and mechanical, just another day's work. Others developed detailed justifications for their actions. Many simply stopped thinking about what they were doing altogether, entering a state of moral shutdown where they functioned without reflecting on the reality of their work. However, another powerful motivator drove participation. SS officers knew that participating in special actions could advance their careers. Refusal or visible reluctance marked them as unreliable, limiting promotion prospects. Enthusiastic participation demonstrated ideological commitment and earned favor. The system rewarded complicity and punished conscience. Adolescents and young adults were particularly vulnerable to Nazi teaching. Those who came of age in the Hitler Youth had been shaped by Nazi ideology since childhood. Schools taught them that Jews were threats, and propaganda surrounded them in films, radio, books, and posters. By the time they were old enough to participate in the Holocaust's machinery, they had already been taught to see mass extermination as necessary duty rather than crime. The transformation reveals a disturbing truth. Complicity in the Holocaust required no special evil. It required only normal human weaknesses, responding to authority, conforming to others, pursuing self-interest, accepting ideological belief, and shutting off conscience. The Holocaust happened not because Germans were uniquely monstrous, but because they were human. Given the right conditions, these same psychological mechanisms can operate anywhere. These mechanisms enabled what came next: extermination on an industrial scale. Section 7. The final phase. By 1942, the Holocaust had become Germany's largest secret and its most open truth at the same time. While the regime maintained official silence about extermination camps, their existence and purpose were widely known through rumor, witness accounts, and soldiers' testimony. This paradox of public knowledge combined with public silence was essential to the Holocaust's continuation. The extermination camps operated with industrial efficiency, refined through experience. Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were purpose-built centers where nearly everyone who arrived perished immediately. No pretense of labor camps existed at these sites. They had no barracks for long-term prisoners, no work facilities, and no infrastructure for sustaining life. They were factories designed specifically and solely for mass extermination. Deportees arrived by train directly into the camps. The selection process, where it existed, was brief and superficial. Most were sent immediately to their fate at Treblinka. Trains pulled into a station area designed to look normal, complete with fake clock and posted schedules. Signs directed arrivals toward disinfection facilities, while guards assured them they were being prepared for work assignments further east. The deception continued until the last possible moment. Every detail was calculated to maintain the deception. Targets were ordered to disrobe and told they were going to showers for hygiene purposes. They were rushed through this process as guards shouted to create confusion and prevent resistance. They were herded into buildings whose exteriors resembled ordinary structures. Inside were gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, complete with fake shower heads. Doors were sealed, gas was released, and those inside perished within minutes, sometimes longer if the chambers were overcrowded or gas supply insufficient. The bodies were then removed, initially buried in mass sites and later burned to destroy evidence. Personal belongings were systematically sorted as clothing, jewelry, currency, and valuables were catalogued and shipped back to Germany. The regime wasted nothing, turning extermination into an economic operation that seized value even from possessions and, horrifyingly, from bodies themselves. The numbers processed through these camps are difficult to comprehend. Holocaust historian Lawrence Rees documents that Treblinka eliminated approximately 900,000 people in just over a year of operation, from July 1942 to October 1943. That represents an average of over 2,000 people per day, every single day, for months on end. Belzec eliminated at least 434,508 people in 9 months of operation, while Sobibor eliminated at least 167,000. These were not excesses or anomalies, but represented the camp's fundamental purpose. The SS officers who commanded them received commendations for efficiency, while bureaucrats who coordinated deportations tracked their quotas like any other administrative goal. But one camp surpassed all of them in scale and organization. The complex eventually included multiple gas chamber and crematorium combinations, designated as Crema 1 through V. The largest facilities, Crema 2 and the third, could each process approximately 2,000 people in a single operation. The entire system, from arrival platform to crematorium, was designed for maximum efficiency and minimum resistance. The camp's layout reveals its true nature clearly. The infamous ramp where trains arrived, later known as the Juden ramp, led directly to the gas chambers and crematoria located only a few hundred meters away. Those selected for immediate extermination never entered the main camp at Auschwitz-WWII or the labor sections of Birkenau. They were funneled straight from train to facilities, their journey from arrival measured in mere hours, sometimes less. The criteria were ruthlessly practical. Children too young to work, the elderly, pregnant women, and anyone appearing sick or weak were all sent to gas chambers immediately. Only those who appeared capable of immediate hard labor were spared, and even they faced probable demise within weeks or months from starvation, disease, or eventual selection when they became too weak. Even in their final moments, targets were kept in the dark. Those sent to immediate extermination experienced a continuation of the deception that had begun with their deportation. They were told they were being disinfected and showered before work assignment. Signs in multiple languages instructed deportees to remember their hook numbers so they could reclaim their clothes after showering. They were rushed through the process as guards shouted to create confusion, then herded into buildings whose exteriors resembled ordinary structures. Inside were gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, complete with fake shower heads. This attention to detail, this cultivation of false hope, served a specific purpose. It reduced panic, prevented resistance, and kept the process orderly and efficient. The gas chambers themselves were underground rooms accessed by stairs. Targets were crowded in, sometimes 2,000 people compressed into spaces designed for half that number. SS guards sealed the doors. Zyklon B pellets, a hydrogen cyanide pesticide, were dropped through openings in the roof. Passing was not always quick. If chambers were overcrowded or gas supply insufficient, those inside might suffer for 20 minutes or more. Witnesses who worked in the Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to process bodies, described scenes of unimaginable horror, people piled on top of each other in desperate attempts to reach air, children trampled, the strongest surviving longest, only to perish last. After the gas cleared, the Sonderkommando entered to remove bodies. They collected gold teeth, cut hair for industrial use, and searched for hidden valuables. Bodies were then transported to crematoria where they were burned. The ashes were dumped in pits or, later, into nearby rivers. The entire complex operated like a production line, with each stage coordinated to maintain continuous flow. New transports arrived even as previous ones were being processed, creating a system where operations never stopped. The regime's determination intensified even as military defeat became inevitable. In 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the East and Western Allies invaded France, resources desperately needed for military defense were diverted to continue deportations. Railway cars that could have transported troops or supplies instead carried Jews to extermination camps. This was not rational military strategy, but ideological obsession. The Hungarian deportations in 1944, already among the Holocaust's deadliest phases, continued at full speed even when Germany's military situation was hopeless. Meanwhile, the German public knew far more than they admitted. The German public's knowledge of the Holocaust was extensive despite official secrecy. As Kershaw documents, the SD intelligence reports tracked public opinion about the Jewish question and found Germans were aware of harsh measures being taken in occupied territories. These reports, compiled regularly by SS intelligence officers stationed throughout Germany, monitored conversations in pubs, workplaces, shops, and other public spaces. They documented what ordinary Germans said when they thought no one official was listening. A report from March 1943 noted explicitly that many Germans had heard about mass executions. The report described public discomfort but also widespread acceptance. Many Germans expressed the belief that Jews deserved punishment for supposedly causing the war, repeating propaganda lines they had heard countless times. Others expressed unease about methods but quickly qualified their concerns, suggesting that perhaps harsh measures were necessary given wartime conditions. Still others changed the subject entirely, preferring not to think about unpleasant matters. The reports reveal several disturbing truths. First, knowledge of the Holocaust was extensive. Soldiers on the Eastern Front witnessed mass shootings and wrote about them in letters home, while officers on leave spoke guardedly about atrocities. Civilians working in Poland saw ghettos and deportations, and railway workers who transported human cargo saw the conditions firsthand. This information circulated through informal channels, family conversations, letters home, and discussions among friends. The regime could not completely suppress it, even though officially everything remained secret. Second, most Germans chose not to investigate further. They heard rumors but did not seek confirmation. They knew something terrible was happening but maintained plausible deniability about details. This willful ignorance served psychological purposes. If they did not know specifics, they could not be held morally responsible. If they did not ask questions, they avoided forcing themselves to make difficult choices about whether to object or resist. Third, propaganda had successfully prepared many Germans to accept that Jews were enemies deserving harsh treatment. Years of conditioning had taken effect. When people heard about mass shootings or deportations, many responded not with horror, but with indifference or even approval. The regime's ideological groundwork had created a population psychologically prepared to accept, or at least not oppose, the Holocaust. The SD reports noted that fear also played a role in public silence. Germans knew that expressing opposition to regime policies was dangerous. The camps that had opened in 1933 for political prisoners still operated. Gestapo surveillance was everywhere. Neighbors denounced neighbors. Speaking out risked arrest, professional destruction, or worse. Therefore, even Germans who felt uneasy about what they heard kept their concerns private. By 1943, survival concerns consumed most Germans. The reports also reveal a population focused intensely on their own survival and immediate concerns. By 1943, Allied bombing had begun affecting German cities, food shortages were growing, and military casualties were mounting. Many Germans were too preoccupied with their own difficulties to spare much thought for what was happening to Jews in the East, as self-preservation overwhelmed empathy. The combination of fear, propaganda-induced hatred or indifference, willful ignorance, and self-preoccupation created conditions where the Holocaust could continue with minimal domestic resistance. This knowing silence enabled the Holocaust's continuation. Active participation required only a relative few: SS guards, camp administrators, and Einsatzgruppen members. Passive acceptance required millions. It required railway workers who scheduled deportation trains without asking questions, civil servants who processed property seizures without considering what happened to the owners, and neighbors who watched Jewish families disappear and said nothing. It required an entire society that chose not to see what was visible everywhere. The psychological method enabling this was simple: People divided their lives into separate mental boxes. In their professional box, they followed regulations without reflection. In their family box, they focused on protecting their own. In their ideological box, they accepted that Jews were enemies. These boxes did not connect with each other, allowing them to participate in the Holocaust's machinery while still seeing themselves as good people. The final phase brought the Holocaust into public view. The forced marches of late 1944 and early 1945 made the Holocaust impossible to ignore. As Soviet forces advanced, camp prisoners were evacuated westward on foot. Tens of thousands of emaciated prisoners walked through German towns in winter, guarded by SS troops who shot stragglers. German civilians witnessed these columns passing and the bodies left behind. They could no longer claim ignorance, yet most still said nothing. Anne Frank's diary provides a window into the Jewish experience during this period. Her family hid in Amsterdam for 2 years before being discovered in August 1944. She wrote about her fears, her hopes, and her stubborn belief in human goodness despite everything. She described hearing Allied planes overhead and imagining liberation, but she never experienced it. Anne Frank perished at Bergen-Belsen in February or March 1945, probably from typhus, just weeks before British forces liberated the camp. Her diary, found and published after the war, put a face to the numbers. Anne was young, intelligent, and hopeful. She wanted to become a writer and experienced first love while in hiding. What happened to her was not exceptional but typical. Millions of others shared similar fates, yet Bergen-Belsen revealed a different kind of horror entirely. This camp was never an extermination center with gas chambers, but became a place of mass casualties nonetheless. As other camps evacuated before Soviet advance, prisoners were transported to Bergen-Belsen. The camp, designed for a fraction of its population, held over 60,000 by April 1945. There was no food, no water, and no sanitation, allowing typhus and other diseases to rage. Unchecked corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. When British forces liberated the camp on April 15, 1945, they found approximately 10,000 unburied bodies and 60,000 prisoners barely alive. Similar scenes greeted Allied forces at camps across Germany and Poland. American soldiers liberating Dachau found prisoners reduced to skin and bones alongside mass burial sites. Soviet troops liberating Auschwitz in January 1945 found survivors and evidence of extermination on unimaginable scale. The liberation footage provided visual evidence to the world of what had been taking place, while international intervention remained absent. The final solution eliminated approximately 6 million Jews, representing 2/3 of European Jewry and 1/3 of the world's Jewish population. The numbers are estimates because the regime destroyed records, targets were never registered, and entire communities disappeared without documentation. In Poland, over 90% of the Jewish population perished. In the Baltic states, approximately 95%. In Germany itself, the pre-war Jewish population was reduced to a tiny fraction of survivors. The casualties included over 1 million children. They included scholars and laborers, the religious and the secular, those who identified strongly as Jewish and those who barely knew they were Nazi. Racial law determined who perished, not cultural identity. The regime targeted converts to Christianity, atheists, and people with just one Jewish grandparent. This was not religious persecution but attempted racial annihilation. The Nazi regime also targeted other groups for systematic extermination. Approximately 200,000 to 250,000 Roma and Sinti peoples were murdered under policies similar to those applied to Jews. Disabled individuals perished in the T4 euthanasia program and its continuation. Soviet prisoners of war, Polish intellectuals, political prisoners, homosexuals, and others deemed racially or socially undesirable also died in massive numbers. While Jews were the primary target of the final solution, the Nazi vision of racial purity claimed countless other victims. The Holocaust did not end cleanly with Germany's surrender. On May 7, 1945, in the early hours in Reims, France, Alfred Jodl, chief of Wehrmacht operations staff, signed unconditional surrender of German armed forces in the presence of British and Americans. On May 8, 1945 in Berlin, Field Marshal Keitel surrendered on behalf of Germany to Soviets. In the final days, as Kershaw notes, Himmler ordered that no prisoners at Dachau and Flossenburg concentration camps should be taken alive when Allies arrived. As a result, even in the last hours of the Third Reich, new forced marches formed. Thousands more lost their lives. One estimate indicates that out of 714,000 inmates alive in concentration camps at the start of 1945, between 240,000 and 360,000 perished before Germany capitulated. A few high-profile perpetrators faced consequences. Himmler ended his life on May 23, 1945, after British captors discovered his identity. He had survived the end of Nazism by only days, biting into a poison capsule while pretending to be Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger. Adolf Eichmann escaped to Argentina, but was captured by Israeli agents in 1960, brought to trial in Jerusalem, and faced consequences in 1962. Though these cases were rare exceptions, the vast majority of perpetrators were never caught or punished. Some lived prosperous post-war lives, their crimes undiscovered or deliberately overlooked. Justice was partial at best. For survivors, liberation was traumatic in unexpected ways. Survivor Giselle Sikowicz, whose testimony Reese documented, recalled how she and other Jewish women imprisoned with her learned the war was over. They heard whistling police whistles that meant roll call and ran out onto a big field on a beautiful sunny day. The girls lined up quickly, unable to delay out of habit. Then they heard through a loudspeaker an SS officer announcing that the war was over, that they were free and could go wherever they wanted. However, the announcement continued with instructions that guards would remain to watch them until the Russian army arrived. Sikowicz later explained why this moment was so traumatic. The instant she heard she was free and could go anywhere, a devastating realization hit her. There was nowhere to go. Returning to the Jewish houses they had left behind meant facing homes where everything her parents possessed had been abandoned, and people were already taking Jewish possessions. She had no desire to live in a place where everyone had stood by while Jews were treated with such evil. And beyond that familiar place, there was nowhere else in the world for her. She spoke about the world's rejection, having read repeatedly about how no country would accept Jews before the extermination took place. No nation wanted them. Israel did not yet exist as a refuge. England, America, Canada with its open spaces, Australia with its vast territories, all had closed their doors. Nobody wanted Jews. She was 18 years old and felt she was nothing. She described why liberation felt so traumatic. In the moment before she realized she was free and could do whatever she wanted, the only thing in the world that interested her was finding something to eat. 70 years later, she said she still could not get over the evil she had witnessed and endured. The Holocaust was not ancient history. Survivors are still alive, though their numbers grow fewer each year, and when the last witnesses are gone, remembering becomes even more essential. 6 million Jews perished, representing 2/3 of European Jewry. Among them were over 1 million children who never had the chance to grow up, pursue their dreams, or live their lives. Behind every number was a person, someone's child, parent, sibling, or friend. Anne Frank wanted to be a writer, and millions of others had their own dreams that were never realized. On April 29, 1945, in his political testament, the Nazi leader blamed international Jewish conspiracy for the war, his worldview remaining consistent to the very end. Even facing certain defeat, he maintained that if the German people lost the war, it would show they did not possess the internal value he had assigned to them. Historian Ian Kershaw notes that while the Nazi leader bore ultimate responsibility for the Holocaust, many others shared the blame. The system of working towards the Führer, combined with competitive efforts to prove loyalty, bureaucratic participation, and public silence, meant responsibility was widely distributed, even as it ultimately concentrated in one figure. Never again is not an automatic promise, but a constant challenge, requiring active commitment from each generation. It means rejecting anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred wherever they appear. It means speaking up when others are scapegoated or dehumanized, regardless of who they are. Anti-Semitism did not end with Nazi Germany, but continues in various forms across the world today. The Holocaust must never be forgotten, minimized, or denied. The suffering of its victims must be honored through remembrance and through unwavering commitment to preventing such crimes in the future. The ideology that enabled the Holocaust didn't appear overnight. Years before Hitler came to power, he wrote a book that would become a blueprint for genocide, codifying the hatred and racial theories that led to the final solution. Watch this video next.